Hey guys, our final podcast for state building and social change in the Americas will focus on the abolition of slavery, women's rights in the struggle for social justice, development and underdevelopment, and then we'll wrap it up and look at some similarities and differences. In the 19th century, the population of the Americas changed dramatically due to immigration. In most of the new nations, rhetorical assertion of the universal ideals of freedom and citizenship contrasted sharply with the reality of slavery. Slavery survived in much of the Western Hemisphere until the 1850s. It was strongest in those areas where the export of plantation products was most important. In the early 19th century, slavery was weakened by abolition in some of the northern states of the U.S. By the termination of the African slave trade to the United States in 1808, and by the freeing of tens of thousands of slaves who joined the revolutionary armies in the Spanish American republics. But at the same time, increased international demand for plantation products in the first half of the 19th century, such as coffee, sugar, tobacco, led to the increased imports of slaves to Brazil and Cuba, while the expansion of cotton product stalled further anti slavery efforts in the United States. In the US, abolitionists made moral and religious arguments against slavery. Two groups denied full citizenship rights under the Constitution. Women and free African Americans played important roles in the abolition movement. The Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in the rebel states not occupied by the Union Army, while final abolition was accomplished with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865. By the end of the 19th century, however, Jim Crow laws in some of the states had begun to erode the rights of African Americans again. In the US, discrimination was based on Catholic and Protestant divisions as well as ethnicity. In Brazil, progress toward the abolition of slavery was slower and depended on pressure from the British. The heroism of former slaves who joined the Brazilian army in the war against Paraguay helped to feed abolitionist sentiment that led to abolition in 1888. In the Caribbean colonies, there was little support for ending slavery among whites or among free blacks. Abolition in the British Caribbean colonies was the result of government decisions made in the context of declining profitability of the sugar plantations of the British West Indies. Abolition of the French colonies followed the overthrow of the government of Louis Philippe in 1848. Slavery was made illegal in Puerto Rico in 1873 and in Cuba in 1886. Although Brazil did not outlaw slavery until 1888, it also relied heavily on immigrant labor. The end of slavery in Brazil and the Caribbean followed the arrival of a large immigrant population to provide replacement labor. As the slave trade ended, immigration from Europe and Asia increased. During the 19th century, Europe provided the majority of immigrants to the Western Hemisphere, while Asian immigration increased after 1850. Among this latter group were thousands of indentured laborers who migrated to the Caribbean. In the second half of the 19th century, women's rights movements made slow progress toward the achievement of economic, legal, political, and educational equality in the United States, Canada, and Latin America. Most working class women played no role in the women's rights movement. Nonetheless, economic circumstances forced working class women to take jobs outside the home and thus to contribute to the transformation of gender relations. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention met in New York. 19th century America, like Europe, created a cult of true womanhood. Geographic location and economic status also determine the nature of women's daily lives. In the movement towards the abolition of slavery, various forms of discrimination against persons of African descent remained in place throughout the Western Hemisphere. At the end of the century, and attempts to overturn racist stereotypes and to celebrate Black cultural achievements in political and literary magazines failed to end racial discrimination. Successful men and women of mixed ethnicity in Latin America faced less discrimination than did those in the US. So we have two very awesome people here. We have Sojourner Truth and Lucretia Mott. Two powerhouses, guys. All right, development and underdevelopment. Nearly all of the nations of Western Hemisphere experienced economic growth during the 19th century, but the US was the only one to industrialize. Only the United States, Canada, and Argentina attained living standards similar to those in Western Europe. These nations shared three things in common: open land, diverse resources, and a large influx of immigrants. After the Union victory in the Civil War, the United States entered a period of population growth and economic prosperity. In the 1880s and 90s, the US began the second industrial revolution. The Gilded Age refers to the last 2 decades in the 19th century. Some farmers in the Midwest or Plain States organized into protest movements. And in 1893, Chicago hosted the Great Columbian Exposition, which displayed the wealth and industrial might of the US. The economic boom turned to bust when it led to overproduction. That happens. Rising demand for mine products led to mining booms in the western United States, Mexico, and Chile. Heavily capitalized European and North American corporations played a significant role in developing mining enterprises in Latin America. The expensive transportation and communications technology also increased dependence on foreign capital. Latin America, the United States, and Canada all participated in the increasingly integrated world market, but interdependence and competition produced deep structural differences among Western Hemisphere economies. Those nations that industrialized achieved prosperity and development, while those nations that depended on the export of raw materials and low wage industries experienced underdevelopment. Cyclical swings in international markets partially explain why Canada and the US achieved development while Latin America remained underdeveloped. Both the US and Canada gained independence during periods of global economic expansion. Latin American countries gained independence during the 1820s when the economy was contracting. It's all about timing sometimes. Weak governments, political instability, and in some cases, civil war slowed Latin American development. Latin America became dependent on Britain and later on the US for technology and capital. Latin Americans fell into what historians call a dependency complex. They depended on exporting raw materials to import manufactured goods. Economic dependency undermined peasant communities, which allowed military men to dominate politics. Population growth and economic expansion, as well as the introduction of new plants and animals, brought about deforestation, soil exhaustion, and erosion. Rapid urbanization put strain on water delivery systems and garbage disposal systems and led to the spread of the timber industry. The expansion of the mining industry led to erosion and pollution in the western United States, Chile, and Brazil. Faced with a choice between protecting the environment or achieving economic growth, all of the hemisphere's nations chose economic growth. Global warming, guys, climate change, it's a real thing. The Senate even passed a bill that said so. All right, expansion of the U.S., 1850 to 1920. Take a look. What's happening? New territories become new states. And in conclusion, focusing on all new nations in the Western Hemisphere drew heavily upon their colonial political traditions. Look at the examples of failed constitutions, why they were failed constitutions as opposed to why the U.S. was not. Take a moment to review the foreign interventions. We're talking about cause and effect here. So right now you're getting the cause. And later on in this unit and the beginning of the next unit, you're going to get the effects of this. So if you guys have any questions at all, please shoot me an email. We will be discussing this in class. And I know this was a lot of information in 3 podcasts, but again, what we're focusing on, why some of these revolutions and constitutions were successful, why some of them weren't, what role does the Enlightenment play in all of this, and again, cause and effect, but also take a look, we'll take a look at change and continuity. So what stayed the same, what's going to change over time, and why. Have a great night, guys. Cheers.